It was a crisp Monday morning in Atlanta. The air buzzed with anticipation inside Steve Harvey's talk show studio, where the crew was prepping for another lively taping. The day's schedule had a twist. Steve had been told a surprise segment was being added. Even he wasn't given full details. That was rare. He always knew everything. But producers just told him, "Trust us, Steve. This one's special." Steve raised an eyebrow but went along. He wasn't one to turn down a little mystery. The cameras rolled, the music played, and the audience roared with their usual cheer. Steve welcomed viewers with his big, trademark smile, throwing out jokes, engaging with the crowd, and hyping up the energy. But midway through the show, the lights dimmed slightly. The main screen behind Steve lit up with the presidential seal, and a soft hush fell over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the producer's voice echoed in the studio speakers, "we have a special guest joining us remotely. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary." The screen transitioned to the White House briefing room. Karoline appeared, dressed sharply, her blonde hair tucked neatly behind her shoulders. But this wasn't a press briefing. She looked relaxed, even warm, a side America rarely saw during her fiery exchanges with reporters. Steve's eyes widened with surprise. Karoline Leavitt? The press secretary? What in the world? Karoline smiled gently. "Hi, Steve. Thank you for allowing me this moment. I know this is unorthodox, but I asked to speak to you today, not as a government official, but as someone who's watched your journey, admired your faith, and wanted to say something personal." The studio was silent. Even Steve leaned in, his usual comedic demeanor softened. "You know," she began, her voice tender, "working in Washington can harden people. The pressure, the judgment, the nonstop noise. It's easy to forget that behind every headline are real people with real hearts. But in the midst of that noise, sometimes we hear a voice, one that cuts through it. Yours, Steve, has been one of those voices for me." Steve blinked slowly, visibly caught off guard. His hands, usually animated and expressive, rested still on the desk. Karoline continued, "I grew up in Atkinson, New Hampshire. We didn't have much. My dad worked double shifts, my mom taught piano lessons. There were nights I'd stay up studying, doubting whether I'd ever make it. But we had one tradition: we watched the Steve Harvey Show every Friday. It made us laugh when things were tough. It brought my family together." Steve chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I didn't know I had that kind of reach." "Oh, you do," Karoline said. "You had it then, and you still have it now." She paused, then glanced off camera for a second, as if collecting herself. "But it wasn't just the laughs. It was how you always ended your shows. You told us to dream big. You spoke about God. You shared your personal failures, your pain, your redemption. That gave me hope that I could overcome my own setbacks. And I did." The audience sat in stunned silence. Steve's eyes now had a different look, softened, glassy. Karoline leaned closer to the camera. "I never told anyone this before, but during my first week as press secretary, I was terrified. I felt like an imposter. I went home, sat in my car, and cried. Then I remembered one of your quotes: 'If you're going through hell, keep going.' That night, I watched an old clip of your speech about trusting God's plan even when it makes no sense." Steve took a deep breath. He pressed his lips together. Something was building inside him. Karoline smiled. "That saved me from quitting. And here I am, still standing." There was a long pause. Steve slowly stood up, stepped away from his desk, and faced the screen. He wiped his eyes once, turned to the crowd, and said softly, "Lord, have mercy." His voice cracked. The camera zoomed in on Steve Harvey's face. His usual smooth and commanding presence was replaced with something raw. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table, and his lips quivered as he looked up at the screen. "Karoline," he finally spoke, voice thick with emotion, you just don't know what that means to me." Karoline nodded gently from the screen, her eyes glistening with emotion of her own. "I just wanted to say thank you, Steve. I owe you that. We live in a world where people often forget to give flowers while someone's alive. You deserved yours today." Steve turned toward the audience, clearing his throat and raising his hands. "Y'all give her a hand. Please, give this young woman some love." The studio erupted in applause. Some people in the crowd were wiping their eyes too. The moment was real, unscripted, A bridge between pop culture and politics, between comedy and conviction. Steve sat back down slowly, his head bowed. You know, when I first started out, I was sleeping in my car, $35 in my pocket. I couldn't see no way out. I wanted to give up so many times. He pointed at the screen. And now you're telling me my voice reached all the way to the White House? Karoline chuckled softly. Yes, sir. It did. And I'm not the only one there who listens. Steve smiled through tears. Well, Lord have mercy. Now that's something. There was a brief silence. Then Karoline added, can I share something else? Something I never thought I'd say on national television. Steve nodded, intrigued. I believe, she said slowly, that the reason I'm in this position right now, working under President Trump, who gave me an opportunity as one of the youngest women to ever hold this job, is because of people like you who dared to be different. You broke barriers. You stood tall when they told you to sit down. You spoke truth even when it cost you. The audience murmured in agreement. Steve's eyes widened again. You've always told people not to hide their faith, Karoline continued. That hit home. Because I struggled with mine, wondering if I could be bold about my beliefs in the political arena. But seeing you pray on national TV, seeing you talk about God without apology, that gave me courage. Steve leaned forward, elbows on the desk, face resting in his hands. He was weeping now openly without shame. The kind of tears that come from a soul being seen. I don't deserve this, he muttered through his hands. I was just trying to make people laugh. Karoline smiled. You did more than that, Steve. You inspired a generation, including a small-town girl from New Hampshire who now stands behind the podium of the most powerful country in the world. The room sat heavy in emotion. The moment had transcended television. Something spiritual had entered the space. Even the production crew was moved. After a deep breath, Steve looked up, wiping his face with a handkerchief. You know, he said softly, my mama used to tell me God's got a purpose for your pain. I didn't know what she meant back then. But maybe, just maybe, this is what she was talking about. He paused. I thought I was just telling jokes. But maybe I was planting seeds. Karoline nodded. You were. The screen began to fade to black as Karoline ended her message. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for planting that seed in me. The lights came back up in the studio. Steve stood, took a deep breath, and turned to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice steadying, sometimes in life, you get a moment that shows you your journey wasn't in vain. This was one of those moments for me. The crowd rose to its feet. The applause was thunderous. But this time it wasn't just admiration for a celebrity. It was love for a man who had unknowingly changed lives. The moment didn't just stay within the four walls of Steve Harvey's studio. Within an hour of the emotional episode airing, clips of Steve's teary response to Karoline Leavitt went viral across social media. Hashtags like hashtag Steve Harvey cried, hashtag Karoline Leavitt thanks Steve, and hashtag Faith in Politics trended on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. News outlets across the spectrum from Fox News to CNN picked it up. The narrative wasn't political for once. It was human. And it was powerful. Today we saw something rare, began an anchor on a primetime broadcast. A show of gratitude. A recognition of influence. And a reminder that faith and kindness still have a place in public discourse. The White House press office confirmed that the message Karoline had delivered to Steve Harvey was personally written by her, with no edits or input from senior officials, including President Trump. Yet, that evening, during a dinner with congressional leaders, President Trump himself addressed it. Karoline's message today, he said, pausing dramatically, was one of the most heartfelt things I've seen in a long time. And let me tell you, that's what real leadership looks like. Real courage. I'm proud to have her on my team. But for Steve Harvey, back home in Atlanta, the emotions were still settling in. Later that night, he sat down with his wife, Marjorie, in their living room, holding a cup of hot tea. I didn't expect any of that today, he whispered. Marjorie leaned over and squeezed his hand. Baby, you don't know how many people you've touched. You've always focused on the next joke, the next hustle, but this is your legacy. Steve stared into the fire crackling in the hearth. She said my words saved her from quitting. And she's standing in the White House. That hit me like a train. He wiped his eyes again. I always talk about God on the show, you know. And I know that turned some folks off. But I can't hide who got me here. And hearing her say that helped her stand strong in her faith too? That's everything. Marjorie nodded. And did you hear what she said about watching your show with her parents every Friday? You brought them hope during hard times. That's powerful. Steve chuckled. Man, I was just trying to get folks to laugh and not think about bills for an hour. Now I find out I was raising future leaders. Just then, his phone buzzed. A message from Oprah. Steve, I watched the segment. Beautiful. That was ministry. Don't ever think you're just a comedian. You're a vessel. Love you, brother. Steve held the phone for a long moment, then smiled. Even Oprah felt it. The next day, Karoline held her regular press briefing and every seat was full. Reporters were curious, some skeptical, some genuinely moved. A journalist asked, "Karoline, why did you choose Steve Harvey, of all people, to share that message with?" Karoline adjusted the mic and replied calmly, "Because Steve Harvey represents something that transcends politics. He's authentic. He speaks from the soul. And in a time when Americans are so divided, I thought it was time we honored those who unite us in ways we often overlook." She paused, looked around the room. "I didn't thank him because he's a celebrity. I thanked him because he's a man who never hid his scars and helped others heal because of it." There were no further questions after that. Later that evening, Steve received a call. It wasn't from a celebrity or political leader. It was from Karoline's father, Mr. Leavitt. "Mr. Harvey," the older man said, his New England accent soft over the line, "I just wanted to say thank you. You gave my little girl courage. You helped shape her heart. And for a working-class dad who always wondered if he did enough, knowing she had your voice in the background all those years, it means more than I can say." Steve choked up again. "You raised a strong one, sir. She did you proud." "I think we both did," Mr. Leavitt replied. 3 weeks after the broadcast, Steve Harvey's team received a request from the White House press office. Karoline Leavitt would be in Atlanta to attend a bipartisan youth leadership event. She wanted to meet Steve in person, off camera, no entourage, no press, no production. Steve agreed instantly. The meeting was arranged quietly at Tyler Perry Studios, where Steve had some private office space. No media, just two people who had impacted each other without ever meeting. Steve stood waiting near the studio's back entrance. Dressed in a dark charcoal blazer and a blue shirt with no tie, he looked calm, but inside, his emotions churned. It was rare for Steve to be nervous, but today felt different. A black SUV rolled up. Karoline stepped out, dressed casually in a powder blue blouse and dark jeans, her blonde hair in a ponytail. She looked younger than ever, not the stern, confident figure people saw at the press podium, but a humble young woman carrying her truth. As she walked toward him, Steve extended his arms. Karoline dropped her bag and rushed forward. They hugged tight, long, and real. "Mr. Harvey," she whispered. "Just Steve, baby," he said, his voice catching again. "You done got me crying on TV. Now here we are." Karoline pulled back, tears already forming. "I meant every word." They sat down in the studio lounge, a warm space filled with family photos, awards, and even a framed note from Nelson Mandela. Steve handed her a cup of coffee. "So," he said, "tell me something. Why me? Out of all the voices, all the shows, why mine?" Karoline smiled. "Because your show was on when I needed it most." She paused, remembering. "When I was 13, my mother had a health scare. Nothing made sense to me. I was angry. Confused. The world felt too big. I didn't know what faith was supposed to look like in pain." She looked into his eyes. "Then one night, I saw a rerun of you talking about God in a suit, telling folks that failure isn't the end. You weren't preaching. You were just being honest." Steve nodded slowly. "That's all I ever tried to do." Karoline continued, "You gave me permission to hope even when everything felt wrong. And as I grew up and entered politics, your voice still echoed. Especially when people told me I was too young, too bold, too Christian." Steve leaned forward. "They told me I was too black, too loud, too country." They both laughed. Then Karoline grew serious again. "In the Trump administration, people think it's all about power and policy. But for me, it's about people. It's about using my platform to speak life, just like you did. I wanted you to know your light made it all the way to the press room." Steve looked down, heartful. "You know," he said, "I never got to tell my mama I made it. She passed before things took off. But I like to think moments like this, she sees them." Karoline reached into her purse and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought you something." He opened it slowly, a simple, hand-carved wooden plaque that read, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you lift while you're here." Below it, a small brass plate was engraved. "From a girl you never knew you raised." Steve stared at it in silence. "I'm putting this in my office," he said, his voice cracking. "Right next to my mama's Bible." They sat for a while longer, sharing stories, laughing, reflecting, even praying together. Before leaving, Karoline turned back at the door. "You taught me it's okay to cry, to believe, to stand strong in the Lord even in the spotlight. Thank you for being a father figure to so many of us who never told you." Steve smiled. "I may tell jokes, baby, but God writes the best stories." A few months later, as summer rolled in, Steve Harvey sat backstage preparing for a very special episode of his show. This time, it wasn't just a regular taping. It was the 25th anniversary of his talk show journey, from the early sitcom days to Family Feud to hosting motivational specials. It had been a ride filled with laughter, heartbreak, faith, and fire. Producers had planned an elaborate tribute. Celebrities, friends, and surprise guests were lined up to honor him. But Steve had just one request. No glitz. No fireworks. Just real moments. He walked out to thunderous applause, visibly emotional, as a large screen behind him played a montage of his most iconic moments, mentoring young men, helping struggling single mothers, comforting veterans, and yes, even crying with Karoline Leavitt. As the crowd quieted down, Steve addressed the audience. I've been blessed with stages, awards, money, fame. But what I never expected, he said, voice rich with gratitude, was the way God used my pain to heal someone else's purpose. He paused. A few months ago, a young woman stood in the White House and said I helped her find her voice. She said my show gave her strength during hard times. He turned slightly, glancing at the front row. Karoline Leavitt was sitting there, smiling through tears, her parents beside her. I told her she made me cry, Steve said. But what I didn't tell her, what I didn't realize until later, is that she reminded me why I ever picked up a mic. The audience fell into a deep hush. Cameras zoomed in on Karoline, visibly moved. Steve continued, we're living in a world where people are yelling so loud, ain't nobody listening anymore. But when someone pauses and says, thank you from the heart, man, that still matters. He walked to the edge of the stage and looked directly at her. Karoline, I know politics ain't easy. And you got the whole country watching your every move. But don't you ever stop being that girl who sat on the couch with her folks, hearing a message of hope. She nodded, whispering, I won't. The band played softly as Steve invited her on stage. She hesitated, but the crowd encouraged her with a standing ovation. Together, they stood side by side, the seasoned entertainer and the young press secretary, connected by a moment of grace that had reached across generations. Karoline turned to the audience. I'm not here today as a representative of any party. I'm here as a grateful daughter, a proud American, and someone who believes that the voices who make us feel are just as important as the ones who make policy. Then, surprising everyone, she reached into her purse again and pulled out a small, blue-covered book. This is my journal, she said. I started it the week I became press secretary. I write in it when I feel overwhelmed or unsure or just need a reminder of why I do this. Page 1 begins with a quote. She handed the book to Steve and whispered, read it. Steve opened the first page and read aloud. Your setback is just a setup for a comeback. Steve Harvey. The audience gasped. Steve closed the journal slowly, eyes glassy again. He turned to her and chuckled through his tears. Girl, you gonna make me cry every time you show up. They hugged again, a long, warm, grounding embrace. No politics. No cameras. Just two hearts understanding each other. As they stepped away, the camera faded to black and Steve's voice rang out in voiceover. God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes they show up in heels and a press badge. That night, as the episode aired nationwide, millions of viewers sat quietly with their families. Some cried. Some smiled. Some reevaluated what influence really meant. And across America, young people scribbled in notebooks, mothers and daughters talked about dreams, and one girl in Iowa wrote in her diary, one day I'll make a difference just like Karoline Leavitt, just like Steve Harvey. Legacy, after all, is the light we pass forward, often without knowing it. And on that unforgettable day, two very different lives proved that light still shines.